So I got a question about anger, and it's good timing because I've been pretty freaking angry this week. So I got a chance to sit with my own experience and come up with something a little bit more organic than um, theoretical. And the question was, just to paraphrase it, there's a lot of Buddhist teachings and Buddhist teachers who say things like you should try not to be angry at all costs, or one of the fruits or goals of practice is to somehow eliminate anger. And frankly, this is delusion. Just try to eliminate anger from your life. I dare you. What you'll need to do is find a way to circumvent hundreds of thousands of years of evolution that have handed you a nervous system that features anger. So good luck with that. There's a famous psychologist. He passed away several years ago. His name was Neil Jacobson. And he was talking about goals. And he said that you should never choose a goal that a dead person would be much better at achieving than you. And so not being angry is a goal that a dead person is going to be much, much better than any of us at. I wanted to read a quote. It's not specifically about anger, but it's one of Sawaki Roshi's sayings. And he's talking about Dogen's, the title of this little chapter here. And this is from the Zen teachings of Homeless Kodo. The title of this chapter is Dogen Zenji's Appeal. So Kodo Sawaki said, one of the reasons Dogen Zenji appeals to me is that he sees Buddha Dharma as the way to live the self. He doesn't think Buddhism is a fairy tale to make people feel better about life. Uchiyama comments later on, to study the Buddha way is to study the self, which is one of Dogen's very famous sayings, enables skeptical modern people to enter Zen practice. Such teaching resonates with those who aren't endowed with much religious piety. But then he goes further. He helps us to see that even though intelligence is one of the abilities of the self is not grasped by intelligence alone. He leads us to the truth of the self that is beyond intelligence, to zazen beyond thinking. So the reason I bring this up is, there's a temptation, I think, when you get a question about any topic to say, here's what you should do, or here are some rules to follow, or you're thinking about it like this, but you ought to think about it like that. And it's understandable, I think, when a question is asked to sort of think there might be a cool tip that a teacher could give you. And as a teacher, there's a pull to give some sort of intellectual clarity to something like, what do we do with anger? You can find plenty of teachers, Zen teachers, psychologists, people talking about tips for dealing with anger on YouTube. And some of those things are really good advice. But the thing is that your anger is yours. And the roots of anger in your life are intimately tied to your life. So if you want to know more about what to do with your anger, then I think Dogen's advice to study the way is to study the self is a really good place to start. How does anger show up in your experience in your life? If you want to study anything, it takes time. It takes patience. It takes persistence. to really understand and grasp something, you have to work at it. And anger is a tricky subject matter because of the intensity of it. It's hard to sit still with anger because there's a strong impulse to it to do something. It's usually tied to that fight flight response, and that fight flight response is inside of us and usually gets activated in response to threat. And in the presence of threat, usually sitting still and taking your time is not the best option. Feeling threat, you know, makes us want to do something immediately, either to get away or to fight and eliminate the threat. I'm not sure if you've ever seen statues of Manjushri, and Manjushri is the bodhisattva of wisdom, usually depicted with a sword in one hand and holding a lotus flower in the other. And the symbolism there is the sword cutting through delusion, and that becomes the origin of wisdom. My favorite statue or depiction of Manjushri is riding a tiger. So he's got the sword and he's got the lotus flower, but he's riding a tiger. And usually the tiger is, sometimes it's sleeping, but a lot of times it's like ferocious. And the symbolism there is really striking to me, that when we sit still and cut through delusion, we can ride the tiger of our desires. We can maybe even start to direct those desires, even anger, in a way that could be skillful. But imagine you just fell out of the sky and landed on a tiger, and you're like sitting in the back of the tiger, and it hasn't realized that you were there yet. And you're kind of holding on. And if you move, the tiger's going to recognize you and it's going to eat you. That's sometimes, I think, how it can feel to be in the middle of anger. It feels like you need to do something, and if you act from that place, either you're the tiger and you're going to eat somebody, or you're going to get eaten. But the thing about tigers and any big cat and any small cat, if you got little cats living in your house, is that they sleep a lot. So, if you hold on for long enough, eventually things start to settle down and you can sort of slink away. So there's a rise and fall to anger that you might start to be able to notice if you sit with it for long enough. The other thing about anger, if we're going to stick with this tiger metaphor, let's just really break it. Let's take it as far as it can go. Is sometimes anger can be frightening. Can feel like it's like you've been handed a baby tiger as a present. And so we might feed it a little bit just to quiet it down for a while, give into it. But if you continue that strategy of feeding your baby tiger over time, it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and scarier and scarier and scarier. So not dealing with your anger, not talking about it, suppressing it, pushing it away, also is not very skillful over time, because it just gets bigger, and then it comes out in ways that are unproductive. So if you really want to understand how anger works in your life, then it's going to take some bravery and courage, and it's going to take some persistence, and it's going to take some time. It's going to take a willingness to really look deeply into what's happening when you're angry, what's happening before anger starts, and what happens when you react from that place. And it might be ugly. You might see some capacities and behaviors that you engage in that are not how you want to be. There might be some pain and suffering that those behaviors cause you and others. And if you can open up to that and see, yourself and others suffering, then maybe something else can open up. Maybe some compassion can open up, some organic compassion, not the type where you sort of try to will your way into it, but real compassion when you witness that suffering. And then something else can start to happen. You can act from that place, not the sort of reactive fight, flight, got to get rid of this threat place, but the tender, maybe sad, vulnerable place that might allow you to really kind of do something that can actually help to maybe soothe or respond to the vulnerable feelings that often are underneath anger. In her book, I can't remember the name of it, Waking Up to What We Do by Diane Rossetto, which we often read in our precept class. In her section on the precept of not indulging in anger, one of the 10 grave precepts, Diane Rossetto talks about a distinction between ego-driven anger and life-driven anger, or it's ego-affirming or life-affirming. And I, although it's sort of a dichotomous this or that way of thinking about it, which I don't love, I do like the idea that anger is in and of itself is an experience and not necessarily good or bad. That it could be a response to life should be this way, and I'm angry because it's not. More about ego. Or it could be a reaction when you notice a cause of suffering in the world, and that anger might motivate you to do something bold in that moment, or in sort of a habitual way to respond to something that isn't right, that's causing suffering. So she gives the example of her teacher, Joko Beck, walking along the beach and seeing two younger men getting into a fight. She must have been in her 70s or 80s. And Joko was very angry and ran over and got between them and started like punching them a little bit. So you can imagine like this elderly woman getting in the middle of two young guys in a fight and screaming like, "Stop it!" And they were taken aback and they stopped. That might be an example of life affirming anger. But the thing is, you're a human being, and you've got a history, and you've got a word machine in your head that will continue to tell you it should be this way or it should be that way, and you're going to get angry. In those moments, one thing that we can start to work on, this is definitely something I've been working on this week, is coming back to that, our first of the 4 vows, which is sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them. And what we can do in those moments is do our best to save all sentient beings from ourselves. We can engage in harm reduction. So if you're in a place where you don't think you're going to be able to be kind to people because you're very grumpy, I know nothing about that, then maybe what's best is you sort of take yourself away from people for a little while. Maybe if you feel like you can do it, you might let people know why you're doing that. Like, I'm going to I'm gonna having a moment, having a week, I'm having a day, so I'm gonna just take some time away. Um, it might mean, if you do something out of anger, that as soon as you do it and you have the capacity, you go back and apologize and own it and say, yeah, that wasn't right. I'm sorry I did that. I'm going to try not to do that again. So, it's going to happen. Anger is going to happen. We can work with it. We can study it and try to learn how to address it and the roots of it more effectively over time. We can engage in harm reduction. We can sometimes notice that anger is something that can fuel effective behavior that might reduce our suffering or the suffering of others. So, I'd actually encourage you to let go of the idea that there's rules to follow when it comes to your anger, and really study it, how it works in your life, and what are some of the responses that are skillful in which contexts and which are the ones that aren't. Your anger can teach you a lot. And I'd rather you learn from your own anger than to take anything that I or anybody else says to you about what you should do when you're angry to heart. Because ultimately, your experience, if you're willing to really pay attention to it, is going to be your best teacher.